In part 1 and 2 of these talks, we have looked at why it is eminently plausible to believe that the Gospel accounts were written by the authors to whom they are ascribed. We have also seen how it makes sense to believe that they were written in Judea within a few decades of the events attested to by direct eyewitnesses, or people who collated eyewitness testimony. Finally, we have seen that the care with which they were copied and recopied over the centuries is highly impressive. As we have seen, the New Testament accounts compare incomparably more favourably in their depth and quality to any other ancient text. The inverted commas Grimm's fairy tales account of their composition just does not stack up. But still, I grant this is still not enough. The typical dating of the Gospels ranges widely and settles on a consensus of between 30 to 60 years after the crucifixion. That is still a long time after the events. If you are recalling what happened 3 decades ago or more, it does seem a tall order to remember it with any form of accuracy. So how can we have any confidence as to the authenticity of the evangelists' recollections several decades later? Before I answer that question, I want to spend a brief moment on the sort of literature we are dealing with. These are documents which are typical of their time, not typical of the 21st century. In our day, we are obsessed with fresh news and lots of it. Everything is documented to the minute by endless, proliferating news outlets, and seemingly every trivial detail of our lives will be of interest to someone, somewhere. If you read biographies of great men or women, they are often voluminous affairs, which give you a blow-by-blow account of their whole life. The Gospels emphatically do not fit into this mould. They do, though, fit well in a type of literary genre, popular at the time they were written. A theologian called Richard Burridge has made a close study of the shape of the Gospels and compared them with Greco-Roman biographies of the time, and they are strikingly similar in style. These Greco-Roman biographies, or lives, would focus on the life of a person, be around 10 to 20,000 words long, and primarily focus in on their birth, their public life and death. They were not strictly chronological and did not fuss over the exact nature of every detail they described, but were rather pen portraits of the person. They are a true account, but should not be seen as verbatim transcriptions of every word uttered by the subject of the biography. The Gospels fit in very well into this type of first-century literature. And this style of literature is emphatically not classed as fairy tale or myth. Josephus's book, The Jewish War, has his stamp and character, and slants the telling of those historical events with his interests in mind. So do the Gospels. Each has its distinctive flavour and emphasis, which the author has stamped on it. But this does not make them fairy tales. They remain very much part of the conventions in which the records of an important life were written in the first century. In writing these accounts of Jesus' life from several decades previously, they would have been helped by a number of factors. The first thing to point out is that Jesus is described as a teacher in the Gospels. He is called a rabbi 12 times, a teacher 40 times, and teaching 45 times. Now, teaching, of course, implies students at a time in the history of Judaism called the Tannaitic period, linked to the word Tanna, meaning one who memorized and taught the tradition of the oral law. So you had 12 specially chosen disciples at a time when the memorizing of oral traditions was of particular importance. On a prosaic level, being taught in pithy and highly memorable parables certainly helps. My second point is that the memory of Jesus' life was a communal one. We are not talking about the maybe sketchy memory of one person. Think about how histories of the Second World War are written. If we take a 30 to 50 year gap after those events, a historian in the 1970s to 1990s living in the UK might have been able to rely on his own first-hand experience of those events, or interviewed eyewitnesses, or talked to people who had heard stories first-hand from eyewitnesses of, say, Dunkirk, the Blitz, or the D-Day landings. If you had written a history of those times where the whole British army was captured in Dunkirk, the Blitz flattened Oxford rather than Coventry, or that D-Day was repulsed by the Nazis, then the book, if it even got to publication, would certainly not have reverently been passed on to future generations as an account of the truth of these events. It would have died and never been seen again, as everyone would have pointed out that it was a lot of nonsense. But this clearly did not happen with the Gospels. Now you might rightly object that comparing the recollection of a whole nation at war with the collective memory of a people regarding the life of one man is a bit of a stretch. Maybe it is. But still, as I said in an earlier talk, there were an estimated 650,000 people living in Judea at the time of Jesus. As described in the Gospels, his public ministry could have lasted as much as 3 years and was not a discreet affair. How could it be if the descriptions of miracles are true? Especially in the Gospel of Mark, you get an impression of Jesus being pressed and hemmed in from all sides by huge crowds following him everywhere. On one famous occasion, a group of friends were so desperate to get to him that they dismantle a roof to hoist down their handicapped friend in front of him. Now, if there is any credence to these accounts, then even 30 years later, a substantial part of the Jewish population would either still be alive to remember these events, or have been told about them by their parents and friends. There would have been a large number of people who would have witnessed highly memorable and unusual events. For that is how we work as human beings. We remember the unusual and forget the humdrum. If you jump out of a plane over Omaha Beach in 1944, you are likely to remember it. If you see a leper cured, or a Lazarus raised from the dead, it will stay with you forever. Let me give you a small example. A few years ago, I got to know a 98-year-old man who had been a bomber pilot during the Second World War. He told me his hair-raising accounts of the war, being shot down over Holland, and his many attempted escapes from prison camps in Germany. Even though the events described were 70 years ago, he still remembered them extremely vividly. And it is the same thing with our own lives. We may have no memory at all of what we ate for lunch a week ago, but have strikingly detailed memories of key moments in our lives. It does not seem at all implausible to my mind that authors, who in some cases were themselves eyewitnesses, could give a fair account of the truth of the collective memory of extraordinary events a few decades previously. Okay, so why have I gone into such, maybe for some might say, mind-numbing level of detail of why we can trust the Gospel accounts? If I had gone into such a laborious explanation to convince you to trust in the writings of Tacitus or Plato, you would have wondered why all such effort. Simply because what I wanted to show is that there really is nothing wrong with the writers themselves. They were Jews from the first century who followed Jesus. There is nothing wrong with the documents themselves. As I have said already, they compare incomparably better with any other ancient document. What is wrong, inverted commas, is what they wrote. What is wrong is in those documents. To the modern mind, what is wrong with the Gospels is that they describe miracles. They describe lepers cured, the deaf, the dumb, the blind, the lame healed. They describe the raising of the dead and above all, they describe Jesus Christ's own resurrection. For the modern post-Enlightenment mind, this is a huge problem. For to many, science has ruled miracles out of court. They just don't happen. All must have a natural explanation. So to make it palatable to modern eyes, one has to water it down. We are comfortable with religion, which provides some spirituality to our lives, but we don't like to look foolish or naive. Hence the great lengths scholarship goes to mould Jesus into the great moral teacher, who is safe and domesticated and only rises from the dead in allegory and myth. Somehow we feel we have grown up and know better than our forebears. But the case is that from the first, Christianity has always been a scandal. Followers of Jesus have always risked ridicule for what they believed. There is a famous Roman graffiti mocking Christians worshipping a crucified man with a donkey's head. To pretty well everyone, it was ridiculous to worship someone who had been tortured to death. And as for rising from the dead, well, what does one say to that? The famous description which Paul gave of the emergent Christian faith is that it was a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. But the English Bible translators are being kind and sparing modern Christian readers. For the original Greek words are the origin of the English words scandal and moron. So a more faithful translation is that it was a scandal to the Jews and moronic to the Greeks. Miracles are indeed scandalous, or worse, to a worldview run on the train tracks of immutable physical laws. To many modern minds, science has become as closely synonymous with truth as it is possible to be. So if it is not vindicated by science, then it is viewed with huge scepticism. Once we lived in the age of faith, now we live by the light of science. But is it really that simple? To start with, the scientific method presupposes a natural explanation to all phenomena. The supernatural is beyond its scope. That is its great strength. It is a tool which, properly handled, is agnostic. Its domain is the testing of hypotheses, verified by experiments accessible to our senses and validated by our reason. The trouble starts when science is unmoored from its origin as a philosophically and theologically neutral tool and becomes the philosophy of scientism. A classic articulation of scientism was made in the earlier parts of the 20th century by a group of thinkers, soon given the name logical positivists, who declared that only statements verifiable through direct observation or logical proof are meaningful. This confident assertion lasted only as long as it took some skeptics to point out that this very statement is itself not verifiable through direct observation or logical proof. That is the problem, or maybe not the problem, but the unavoidable fact that all worldviews have to start with a given, an article of faith, which itself must be taken on trust. In the case of theism, it is the existence of a personal God. In the case of scientism, it is the infallible trustworthiness of our senses and reasoning capacities. This has to be taken on trust. Every worldview starts from a position of faith. From that position of faith, it then moves out and makes sense of the world around it. This can be quite uncomfortable, as certain aspects of our experience as human beings do not fit into that initial premise taken on faith. If you take Christianity, if the starting point of faith is an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing personal God, then why is there so much suffering and evil in the world? Surely, if he is all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful, he would not allow evil and suffering to exist. I look at this perennial problem and doubt for Christians in another YouTube video. But as I said, all worldviews will have aspects of the world which do not fit into that initial premise taken on trust. If we take atheist materialism, what is most real, indeed the foundation of all reality, is not a personal God, but impersonal matter, atoms, stuff. We and all we see are nothing but differently arranged groups of chemicals. That is quite troubling. For if what we cherish most as personal beings, what makes us most human, is ultimately nothing but the projection of a chemical substrate, then can these cherished attributes honestly be described as real in any meaningful sense? Free will, morality, any sense of purpose, personality, our ability to reason our way to truth, are simply the inevitable outworkings of the interplay of eternal physical laws and chemistry. They are, as it were, determined at the Big Bang. All these 5 attributes of humanity are as illusory as the projection of a film onto a screen. We may think we are free, that we exist, can reason, lead purposeful lives, and choose between right and wrong. But if what is most fundamental about us is our chemical nature conforming to physical laws, then all that we hold most dear, what makes us human, are just fleeting patterns of colour and light projected onto a wall. And that, for me, is a small part of the reason why I'm not an atheist. Simply because if you follow the logical path from that initial premise that we are nothing but chemicals, then you end up in a world I absolutely do not recognise. I believe I am a person who exists, has some form of free will, is constrained and guided by a sense of right and wrong, can use my reason to find some aspects of the truth, and that in the same way that my hand is made to grasp and a wing to fly, my life has a purpose. This world I live in, these beliefs, sit much more comfortably if your initial premise of what is ultimately real starts with a personal God rather than impersonal matter. So no, I do not believe it is as simple as to think that on the side of the angels you have scientific truth and certainty, whilst on the other you have faith and all things fanciful. All worldviews start from a position of faith, and all worldviews must struggle with the world we live in, which does not seem to fit in neatly and tidily into the initial premise taken on trust. That goes for all forms of theism as well as atheism. So when we are confronted with the miracles described in the New Testament, one must ask a few questions before dismissing them out of hand. If there is a God, why should miracles be impossible? If these Gospels can be trusted as having been written within living memory of the miracles described, does this mean that the Gospel writers are lying? It is not as if they were more gullible about these things 2,000 years ago than we are now. A miracle, by definition, is an extremely unusual and rare event. Otherwise, it would not be a miracle. As I will explain in part 5 of this series, when we will be looking at the resurrection, you could actually argue that they would have been even more sceptical of the possibility of resurrection then than we are now. Finally, my last question: do these deliberate falsehoods fit in comfortably in the whole tone of the way the Gospels are written? This is where I would encourage anyone to just read the 4 Gospels. They are short, the 4 of them weighing in at just under 100 pages, and so can be tackled easily over the course of a week. It is the best way to simply see for yourself and see whether they come across as myth, whether the authors come across as honest. It will, of course, help with the question at the heart of this series of videos. Did Jesus ever claim to be God? This will make up the 4th part in this series. We will then conclude with the final part by looking at the evidence for the resurrection and why Christians believe that it is the event on which the credibility of Christianity itself stands or falls.